Hello. In this lesson, I'll show you how to model, rig, and animate a 3D version of the characters from the Fundamentals on After Effects course. Modeling will be based on subdivision surfaces. They allow you to get a smooth surface by smoothing a low-poly object. This is a very convenient method of modeling, for you can control and animate a complex surface with a much simpler geometry. Moreover, smoothing is non-destructive. That is, you can adjust the degree of detail at any time or disable smoothing altogether. This method has its drawbacks as well. The resulting surface is highly dependent on the topology of a low-poly object. Ideally, it should consist of quads. This aspect sometimes requires additional actions. The rig will be quite simple and will be mostly based on clusters, but this will be sufficient to recreate such animation. The rig of the eyes and the mouth will be more complex technically. You'll be able to move them freely around the head surface. So I'll create a head. First, I'll middle-click to hide the unnecessary windows, thereby clearing up the space. And I'll create a cube. Now it is a parametric primitive, and its geometry is defined by parameters. Cinema 4D doesn't allow you to move points and modify the topology of a parametric primitive. So to edit it, you need to convert it into a polygonal object by clicking the Make Editable button. I want to add more points to get more control over the shape. I'll switch to the polygon mode. Right-click and select Subdivide. But first, I'll check its properties by clicking the icon on the right. I need to set two subdivisions and to check the Smooth Subdivision box. So we've got a grid that consists of quads mostly uniform in size. This will allow us to get a good result after using the subdivision surface. Now I'll add an ear. First, I'll also create a cube, reduce its size, and place it beside the head. Something like this. I'll add a segment along the X and Y axis to create additional edges. And then I'll also convert it into a polygonal object. Now in the polygon mode, select the front polygons and move them inward with the Extrude Inner tool. Something like this. Then I'll switch to the point mode and adjust the shape. I'll isolate the ear in the viewport by selecting Viewport Solo Single. I'll select these polygons and delete them. Then I'll select Loop Selection. Select this loop of polygons and narrow it a little. And now let's disable Viewport Solo Single. To attach the ear to the head, I need to combine both of these objects into one. To do this, select them, go to Objects, and select Connect Objects plus Delete. Now I'll delete both of these polygons on the head and adjust the position of the ear. Select the polygon on the ear and enable Select Connected to select all the polygons of the ear. Move it a little to the right. Then I'll switch to the Edge mode and select the Bridge tool. Next, I'll drag the ear edge to the head edge like this. Close the remaining hole with the Close Polygon Hole tool. I'll add the subdivision surface object to check how the surface will look after smoothing. I'll drag our object into it. And you can see that the transition between the head and the ear is too smooth. To make it sharper, I'll use the Loop Path Cut tool and add another edge loop to the base of the ear. Click on the horizontal edges and move the percentage slider to achieve the result you want. To create an ear on the opposite side, I'll simply mirror half of this object. First, I'll select the polygons on the left side, delete everything, then create the symmetry object. By default, its mirror plane is set to ZY. That is, it will mirror relative to this plane. I'll drag the symmetry object into the subdivision surface and the cube into the symmetry. Now I can edit points only on one side, and they will be automatically mirrored to the other side. I'll slightly adjust the ear shape. Note that the center points should be strictly in the center. Otherwise, the symmetry object will not be able to sew them together and holes will appear. Now I'll add a body. I'll create a cylinder and place it under the head. I'll make it wider. Something like this. Disable caps in the Caps tab, decrease the number of rotation segments to 12, and increase height segments to 4. I'll also convert the body into a polygonal object and adjust the shape a little. To add an arm, select this point and use the bevel tool to create a polygon here. I'll drag it in the viewport. You can see that a polygon has been created. Select it and use Subdivide. I'll decrease the number of subdivisions to 1 to create additional points. I'll make the resulting polygons slightly larger and move them to the side. You can see that we have additional edges, and they are likely to create issues when smoothed. Hold down Alt and click on this icon so that the cylinder is inside the subdivision surface. And you can see that the surface is uneven. I'll select the cylinder, switch to the edge mode, and select these two edges. And with the help of Dissolve, I'll remove them. You can see that the quads are smoothed much better now. Then I'll select these edges and delete them as well. The surface is smoother now. I'll select the polygons at the base of the arm and delete them as well. Now I'll switch to the edge mode. Double-click this edge loop and holding down Ctrl, extrude the edge. I'll adjust the edge to make it even. And now, with the Loop Path Cut tool, I'll add a few edge loops. If you hold down Shift, you'll create an edge loop in the middle of the selected edge. Now I'll close the top hole with the Close Polygon Hole tool. I'll isolate the object in the viewport and use the Line Cut tool to create additional edges. Like this. I'll ignore the left side for now because I'll use the symmetry object as well. Select these polygons and use the Bevel tool to add one edge loop. Something like this. Now I'll select all the polygons on the left side and delete them. And holding down Alt, click on the symmetry object to create such a hierarchy. You can conveniently modify the shape of an object by using brushes from the Sculpt tab. I'll use the Grab brush to move the points and make the shape more appealing. Holding down Shift, you can smooth the vertices, which is very convenient. And we have gaps in the center. So first I'll select all the center points. Next, holding down Shift, I'll use the Scale tool to set them all to 0 along the x-axis, to arrange them in one line. And then, in the Coordinate Manager, I'll set the x-coordinate to 0 so that they are located strictly in the center. At this stage, I'll only set the basic shape of the character, trying to use as few polygons as possible. And then, when all the polygons are ready, I'll adjust the proportions and add details when necessary. Next, I'll add pants. I'll start by creating the symmetry object and then, holding down Shift, click on the cylinder button to place it inside the symmetry object. I'll disable caps and reduce the number of rotation segments to 8. Then I'll convert it into a polygonal object, select all the points, and place them like this. Now I'll select the Line Cut tool. Uncheck the Visible Only box to cut the polygons from the backside as well, and make 2 such cuts. I'll isolate the object in the viewport by selecting Viewport Solo Single. I'll select these 2 polygons and scale them down along the x-axis to 0%, so that they are on the same plane. Then I'll set the x-coordinate to 0 to move them to the center, scale them up a little, and then delete these polygons. I'll create the subdivision surface to see how the smooth surface looks, and we'll adjust the shape a little. Now with the Line Cut tool, again I'll cut the leg in the center and add 2 edge loops here and here. Now I'll add a hand. First, let's create a cube and position it like this. I'll set 3 segments along the x-axis and 3 segments along the z-axis. I'll create a symmetry object, drag the cube into it, and make a hand on the other side. Let's also create a subdivision surface to smooth the geometry right away. Convert the cube into a polygonal object and isolate the hand in the viewport by selecting Viewport Solo Hierarchy. I'll delete these polygons at the base of the wrist and adjust the palm a bit before adding fingers. Now I'll select these polygons at the base of the fingers and select the Extrude tool. In its properties, I'll set maximum angle to 0 so that the fingers are extruded independently of each other. By adjusting the offset parameter, I'll move them like this. Then, with the normal scale tool, I'll narrow down the fingertips and add an edge loop with the Loop Path Cut tool in the center of each finger. I'll move the fingers down a bit. Then, in the edge mode, I'll double-click the edge loop at the base of the wrist and, holding down Ctrl, extrude these edges twice to create the geometry of the forearm. Next, I'll slightly adjust the shape of the hand by transforming the points and using the Grab brush. Next, I'll add a leg. Create a cylinder, decrease the number of rotation segments to 8, and disable caps. I'll move it down and make it smaller. Something like this. Then, holding down Ctrl, I'll copy the cylinder, change the orientation to +Z, and increase the number of rotation segments to 10. I'll make the leg larger. Move it like this. Isolate both cylinders in the viewport and convert it into polygons. I'll adjust the shape of the lower cylinder. Like this. Then, with the Close Polygon Hole tool, I'll close the holes at both ends. Next, I'll select the Line Cut tool and check the Visible Only box to cut only visible polygons. And I'll make such cuts. I'll also do the same on the back side. Then let's slightly modify its shape. And I'll select the Line Cut tool again. This time I'll uncheck Visible Only to cut all polygons. And I'll also add an edge loop in the heel area so that it doesn't smooth out that much. Let's create the subdivision surface to see how the smoothed geometry looks. And I'll drag the first cylinder into the second one to smooth it out too. Let's create the symmetry object, drag it into the subdivision surface, and drop the cylinders into it to create the second leg. I'll merge both cylinders into one object. Select Connect Objects plus Delete. Now I need to convert the symmetry objects into polygons so that the geometry can be edited on both sides. So I'll select them all and click the Make Editable button. I'll put the scene into order a bit. I'll rename all polygonal objects, create a null, and move all the body parts into it. I'll delete the rest of the objects, leaving only one subdivision surface, into which I'll drag the null in order to smooth all the character's parts at once. I'll add a cap now. For this, I'll select the head and select this area. Then, using the Split tool, I'll create a copy of these polygons. I'll rename this object to Cap and make it a little bigger. Then I'll select the bottom edge loop with a double click and holding down Ctrl, extrude these edges to create additional geometry. Next I'll select these side edges to make a visor, and holding down Ctrl, extrude them to create the geometry. The transition is too smooth at the moment, so I'll create a support loop at the base of the visor. Like this, to make the transition rougher. As you can see, the shirt, cap, and pants surfaces have no thickness. You can manually select these polygons, but you can do it differently. Select all the objects and group them by pressing Alt-G. And now let's create the cloth surface object from the Simulate menu. I'll move it inside like this, and move the null with the close into it. I'll disable the subdivision surface and enable the display of lines. In the cloth surface settings, I'll set subdivisions to 0, for I'm using the subdivision surface. And then, with the thickness parameter, I'll make the surface thicker, like this. Now, if I enable the subdivision surface, you'll see that the surface looks a little strange at the edges after smoothing. You should add supporting loops to make the edges neater. Select the Loop Path Cut tool and add a loop on the edges where you need them. And do the same for cap. Something like this. So the general shape and topology of all the character's parts are set. And now you can recreate the pose from the reference by simply manipulating the geometry points. And since the animation we want to recreate is quite simple, you can avoid creating a complex complete rig for the entire character and rig only moving parts. But before I start recreating the pose, I'll assign a base material with color to the corresponding parts, in order to make the character's shape clearer. I've uploaded a reference picture into Texture View, from which I'll pick the color of the corresponding material. And I'll assign materials to the corresponding parts. I'll apply the skin materials to the legs object. Then I'll double-click the boot and select its polygons, and drag the boot material to them in the viewport. Now you can pose the character. Cinema 4D allows you to manipulate the points of several separate objects at once. So I'll select all parts of the character, go to the points mode, select all the points, and move it up so that it stands on the grid. The transformation tools have several interesting features. For example, I'll select these points, select the Rotate tool, and enable Soft Selection in the Soft Selection tab. It allows you to use the tool outside of the selected area within a certain radius. As you can see, the impact area is highlighted in color. If I rotate, you'll see that the tool also impacts unselected points within a certain radius. I'll switch to the Modeling Axis tab. The axis parameter sets the center of the tool transformation. By default, it is set to Selected. This means that it is in the center of the selected area. If I want to rotate the arm, for example, relative to the shoulder, I need to change this parameter to Free, enable Pivot Manipulation, or press the L key on the keyboard. Now I can move the center of the transformation as I want it. I'll place it here. I'll disable the Pivot Manipulation and enable the Rotate tool. You can see that it rotates relative to the new position now. Note that Cinema 4D doesn't allow you to edit multiple selected objects with a brush simultaneously. You can only edit one object at a time. You can see that the elbow is too smooth now, so I'll add a couple of supporting edge loops to fix this. Something like this. As a result, I've got this pose after all the manipulations. I've added a few edge loops here and there, on the pants, on the back, and on the arms. And now I'll combine all the objects inside the cloth surface into one object. Then I'll rename it, move it up, and delete the null.